Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and good day to all of you. I am Najiha Samporna. In this video presentation, I will discuss the topic entitled Translation as a Political and Ethical Act, Cultural Untranslatability, Linguistic Negotiation, and Machine versus Human Translation, Accuracy, Nuance, and Bias. In this discussion, I will be examined through two main perspectives in translation studies, the cultural studies perspective and translation fidelity. As we know, translation is commonly understood as the process of transferring meaning from one language to another. However, translation is not simply replacing words from one language with words in another language. It means language reflects culture, identity, and social values, which means translation also involves interpreting meaning within cultural context. Now, because of this, translation scholars today emphasize that translation is a complex process shaped by cultural influences, historical background, and the translator's interpretive decisions. In other words, translation is not only linguistic but also cultural and social in nature. Now, in this video presentation, I will first explain the conceptual and theoretical framework of translation from these perspectives. Then, I will discuss several relevant issues such as cultural untranslatability, the linguistic negotiation, and the challenges of machine translation. And finally, I will provide a synthesis, conclusion, and a recommendation based on the findings from the literature. Moving on to the conceptual and theoretical framework, first one is the translation and cultural context. Translation studies have evolved significantly over time. Earlier approaches focused mainly on linguistic equivalence, meaning translators attempted to find the closest word or phrase in another language. However, modern scholars argue that translation must also consider cultural meaning and social context. Now, one important development in the field is known as the cultural turn in translation studies. So this shift emphasizes that culture should be the central focus when analyzing translation rather than only linguistic structures. According to Chen and Huang 2014, the cultural turn highlighted that translation involves transferring cultural meaning between societies. Now, from this perspective, translators are not simply language technicians. Instead, they function as cultural mediators who interpret ideas and meanings across different cultural contexts. Next is the cultural studies perspective. Now, the cultural studies perspective views translation as a process that connects cultures, social practices, and systems of knowledge. It recognizes that language is embedded in cultural values and that translation, therefore, involves interpreting cultural meanings. Scholars such as Susan Basnet and Andre Lefebvre contributed to this perspective by arguing that translation is influenced by ideology, power relations, and historical context. This means that translation is not always neutral. Translators make decisions that influence how texts are interpreted and how cultures are represented in another language. Now, because translation shapes how cultures and ideas are represented, many scholars argue that translation should be understood as both a political and ethical act. Lawrence Vinotti explains that translation practices often attempt to make translations appear natural in the target language, which can make the translator seem invisible to the reader. However, translators actively shape meaning through their choices, even if their role is not immediately visible in the translated text. For instance, translators may decide whether to maintain foreign cultural elements in a text or adapt them to make text for readers to understand. So these choices can influence how the original culture is perceived. Therefore, translation involves ethical responsibility because translators must balance accuracy, cultural respect, and clarity when representing another culture. Another important perspective in translation studies is translation fidelity. Now, translation fidelity refers to the degree to which a translation remains faithful to the original meaning, tone, and intention of the source text. This perspective focuses on how accurately a translation conveys the meaning of the original text while also maintaining readability in the target language. Translators often face the challenge of balancing literal accuracy with natural expression, especially when cultural differences exist between languages. According to Gambier and Van Doorslee, translation is not only about transferring words but also about preserving meaning, style, and communicative purpose. Because of this, achieving full fidelity is not always possible, particularly when cultural concepts do not have direct equivalents in another language. As a result, translators must make careful decisions about when to remain close to the original text and when to adapt meaning for clarity and cultural understanding. Next is the relevant issues in translation. So one major issue in translation is cultural untranslatability. This occurs when certain words or concepts in one language do not have an exact equivalent in another language. Languages reflect the unique experiences and traditions of the cultures that use them. As a result, some expressions cannot be translated directly because their meanings are deeply rooted in cultural context. For instance, certain idioms, cultural references, or social concepts may not exist in other languages. So when translators encounter these expressions, they must interpret the meaning and find alternative ways to communicate the idea. This challenge demonstrates that translation is not always a straightforward process of finding equivalent words. Instead, it requires cultural understanding and interpretive judgment. To address cultural differences between languages, translators engage in what scholars describe as linguistic negotiation. Linguistic negotiation refers to the strategies translators use to bridge cultural and linguistic gaps when direct translation is not possible. So these strategies may include paraphrasing the concept, explaining the meaning in more detail, adapting the expression to the target culture, or borrowing the original term. So, through linguistic negotiation, translators attempt to preserve both the meaning and cultural significance of the original text. So, this process highlights the important role of translators as interpreters who facilitate communication between cultures. Now, in recent years, technological advancements have introduced new forms of translation, particularly the machine translation systems. Machine translation uses artificial intelligence and computational algorithms to automatically translate text between languages. So these systems have become widely used because they allow for rapid translation of large amounts of information. However, despite these advantages, machine translation has several limitations. Research suggests that machine translation systems often struggle with cultural nuance, idiomatic expressions, and contextual meaning because machines rely primarily on statistical patterns and language models, so they may produce translations that are technically correct but culturally inaccurate. Another issue related to machine translation is the possibility of bias and semantic drift. Semantic drift refers to the phenomenon in which the meaning of words shifts during translation due to differences in cultural context between languages. According to Wu and others, machine translation systems may unintentionally alter meaning when cultural concepts do not align between languages. Additionally, machine translation systems may reflect biases that exist in the data used to train them. So, if the training data contains cultural stereotypes or imbalances, these biases may appear in the translated output. So, these issues raise ethical concerns about relying solely on automated translation technologies. Now, although machine translation has improved significantly, human translators still play a crucial role in ensuring accurate and culturally sensitive translations. Human translators possess contextual knowledge, cultural awareness, and interpretive skills that machines cannot fully replicate. So they are able to recognize subtle meanings, emotional tone, and cultural references within text. Because of this, human translation remains essential in fields such as literature, diplomacy, education, and legal communication, where nuance and cultural accuracy are particularly important. Machine translation can therefore be seen as a useful tool, but it should complement rather than replace human expertise. Based on the literature discussed in this presentation, translation can be understood as a complex process shaped by linguistic, cultural, and technological factors. The cultural studies perspective emphasizes that translation involves interpreting cultural meaning and negotiating differences between societies. At the same time, the concept of translation fidelity highlights the importance of maintaining the original message and intention of a text. Issues such as cultural untranslatability and linguistic negotiation illustrate the challenges translators face when transferring meaning across languages. Furthermore, the rise of machine translation introduces new possibilities for efficiency and accessibility, but it also raises concerns regarding cultural nuance, bias, and accuracy. Taken together, these perspectives suggest that translation should be viewed not only as a technical process but also a cultural and ethical practice. So, based on the findings from the literature, it is recommended that translation practices integrate both technological tools and human expertise. Machine translation can support efficiency and accessibility in global communication. However, human translators should remain responsible for interpreting cultural meaning and ensuring ethical representation of text. Additionally, translation education should emphasize cultural awareness and ethical responsibility so that translators are prepared to address the complex challenges involved in cross-cultural communication. So, by combining technological innovation and cultural understanding, translation can continue to serve as a bridge that connects languages, societies, and ideas. And that's the end of my video presentation. I hope you learned and thank you. Bye!